Chapter 7. Using practice questions and Anki efficiently. Practice questions and Anki are two of the most powerful tools for Step 1 preparation, but only if it's used correctly. In this chapter, I'll walk you through how to make the most out of your practice questions and how to build effective Anki routine decks. I also explain why creating your own Anki cards is more effective than relying on third-party decks. So what you could expect is a step-by-step guide on using practice questions as targeted practice for improving your test-taking skills, and how to create personalized Anki decks with cards that reinforce what you need to know for Step 1. Also, strategies for combining your practice questions with your Anki decks to maximize retention and test performance. One of the big questions is, which question bank is better? A common question people ask is, which question bank is best for Step 1 preparation? Both of the major options, Amboss and UWorld, are reputable. They invest significant resources into crafting questions that are relevant for Usmle Step 1, at least for MD programs. Unfortunately, I don't have much experience with DO programs, so I can't speak of how well these question banks align with their exams, but for MD medical schools, these are the main ones. The question isn't really about the quality of the questions, because they're both great in their respects, but more about how well the question banks reflect the actual exam's content distribution. It's all about how effectively the platform's interface supports your exam prep. And some are better than others depending on the person. Ultimately, your goal is to choose the question bank that gives you the most practice in areas that are the most relevant to Step 1, based on the exam's content distribution that Usmle publishes every single year. So there's a table that breaks down how many questions from UWorld and Amboss are dedicated to each system compared to the expected number of questions you'll see on Step 1 for that system. You'll also find a column showing percentages of questions from 280 questions in Step 1 exams, with the range that gives you an idea of the low, average, and high amount of questions you could expect from that system. So it's not an exact number, but it's a range. And so if that range overlaps with where your strengths are and your weaknesses are, that's what you need to focus on. When I analyze these question banks, I focus on the comparisons between the number of questions in the question bank versus the expected number of questions you could see in Step 1 for each system. If there's a low number of questions in the question bank, but a high percentage of questions expected on Step 1, for that system, I prioritize that system during practice. On the flip side, systems that have a high number of questions in the question bank, but a low percentage of questions expected on the exam, that goes to low priority. I'm looking at Myocardial. So when assessing which question bank is better for your prep, it's smart to prioritize systems where the question bank offers an ample amount of practice for the areas that will be heavily tested on for Step 1 based on the official content breakdown. This way, your study time is spent efficiently targeting high yield material consistently. And so when we look at the chart, you can see that we have a high amount of questions for multi-system. You could expect on average about 38. And then in general principles, you could expect about 39. But they've since gotten rid of general principles and they've distributed across all the different systems. And they've also added human development. And so with respect to human development, you could expect about 6. And then we have our neuro and behavioral stuff, which is about 34. Pulmonary and renal, it's about 35. Cardio is about 24. Reproductive and endo, it's going to be about 31. So you could see a solid breakdown of all the different questions you could expect on a low and a high range, and also an average for Step 1. And so when you're looking at this, you want to look at, when we're talking about UWorld or Amboss or even Usmle RX, what question bank is going to give you the most for the most questions to better prepare you for the most high yield stuff that will happen on Step. And this is just raw numbers. And so if we just focus on UWorld for a second and we focus on cardio is expected to have about 9% on average on your exam, which represents about 24 questions out of 280 questions. And so for that 24 questions, you have a pool of 422 questions to prepare for 24 questions on that exam, right? But we can look at MSK and Derm, and there are about 274 questions in UWorld to better prepare you for 10% of the exam, which is 27 questions. And if we take that a step further, because I'm big on communications and the social sciences, and so social sciences is about 8% of the exam, which amounts to 21 questions. That's about 3 questions less than cardio, right? And so you have a total of 116 questions to prepare you for 21 questions. There's only so many things they could ask you. And so in my mind, I would put more of my money towards that 116 questions to prepare for 8% of the exam than 422 questions to prepare for 9% of an exam. Because you could afford to miss 9% if the return on it is that you have to invest so much into those questions, 422 questions. It's a lot. And more importantly, since general principles is such a high yield thing, almost 40 questions, right? 14% of that exam. You can devote 246 questions. That is a very good return on your investment, especially compared to cardio or pulmonary and renal, which combined, cardio, pulmonary, and renal only make up about 24% of your exam. If that, maybe 22. But that is almost 1,000 questions for 22% of the exam, right? Whereas 14% of the exam for general principles, you could expect to get about 39 questions. And that, to prepare for that, it's only 246, right? So most questions, most high yield. And then here's a good breakdown of the AMBOSS, Usmle, and the UWorld question breakdowns. A lot of them are heavily based on certain strengths that they have. And so you can look at the charts to say, if you really need help with general principles and you haven't chosen a question bank yet, then maybe you should consider Usmle RX because they have 16% of their question bank is all general principles. There's a lot of overlap between AMBOSS and UWorld, but for the most part, you have some options to choose from. So how to use practice questions. Practice questions are often a gold standard, especially with UWorld. Me personally, UWorld is often considered one of the gold standards when it comes to question banks for step 1. AMBOSS and Usmle RX, depending on the school that you go to, they're also pretty good as well. But for me, the questions in UWorld are challenging and the explanations are thorough. However, simply doing questions isn't enough. You need to use your question banks strategically to maximize its effectiveness. So here's how to get the most out of the practice question. Focus on high yield areas first. Start with the most high yield sections, which typically include general principles such as biochemistry, genetics, immunology, cell and molecular biology, also just regular biochemistry. And those are like metabolism, enzymes, hormones, and deficiencies. Then biostats and communications. Those are the social sciences, so ethics and patient interactions. And then pharmacology, so drug mechanisms of action and adverse effects. These areas form the foundations of your step 1 knowledge, and mastering them early on will give you a strong start. Avoid mixed random blocks. Although many people recommend doing random mixed blocks of 40 questions, I found that this method is very inefficient. Step 1 isn't evenly distributed across topics. So you're more likely to waste time on less represented subjects like renal and pulmonary. Instead, focus on 5 to 10 question blocks targeting high yield topics in specific areas you're weak in, and do a total of 80 to 100 questions of those. Use tutor mode for learning. Always start doing questions in tutor mode. This allows you to learn as you go rather than waiting until the end of the block to review your answers. After each question, whether you got it right or wrong, ask yourself, if I got it right, what information did I know that allowed me to get the answer correctly? If I got it wrong, what information did I need to know to get the answer right in less than 90 seconds? Write down the answer to both questions and add them to your crib sheet for later review. This active engagement will help reinforce concepts and prevent passive reading. Use practice questions for test-taking skills, not just content review. Step 1 isn't just about knowing the material, it's about knowing how to take the exam and using the material in it. Practice exams are the best tools for practicing this skill. As you go through questions, focus on time management. Practice answering questions within 90 seconds. Pattern recognition. Identify key clinical patterns, especially in common diseases. And process of elimination. Practice ruling out incorrect answers to improve your test taking efficiency. Even if you don't know the answer, you can narrow it down to 2, and then it's a 50-50 chance. Review and create crib sheets. After completing each practice question block, review the answers thoroughly and create crib sheets summarizing the key concepts from questions that you got wrong. Write down 1 to 2 sentences that answer what piece of information was necessary to get the question right in less than 90 seconds, and why did I get it wrong? What's the key takeaway from this? These crib sheets will become your go-to review material, especially in the final weeks leading up to the exam. At the end of every day, you shouldn't know what you need to study because you have a whole list of things that you already know you need to study. You wrote it down. How to answer questions. Practice questions often contain a lot of irrelevant information or fluff that can be distracting. It's easy to get lost in these details, but it's critical to sift through the noise. I noticed this both while I was doing tons of practice questions and during my actual exam. The key is to focus on the core question. After reading it, pause for a couple of seconds to think critically about what they're actually asking you. This will help clarify the question and make it easier to eliminate the incorrect answers. Answering the question effectively is all about building a systematic process to it. It may not feel intuitive at first, but with regular practice, doing 80 to 100 questions a day, this approach will become second nature to you, like no time. This method saves time and reduces confusion, which is crucial on test day. If you come across a particularly tough question and don't know the answer, you can still use the process of elimination to narrow down to one or two choices. This strategy increases your odds by selecting the correct answer 1 out of 2 times, as opposed to guessing from all the options that you have, which drops your odds to at least 25%. You don't want that. 50-50 or nothing. Here's a streamlined approach that I use for tackling practice questions efficiently. Start with the last sentence of the passage. This is usually where the actual question is posed. Highlight the key question to avoid distractions from unnecessary details, allowing you to focus on what is being asked visually. If you already have an idea of what it's asking, skip straight to the answer choices and make your selection. If the question isn't clear yet, go back to the second to last sentence and gather more clues. If you're still unsure, now you can read the entire passage from the beginning, but stay focused on the clues directly relevant to answering the question. Nothing else. Now that you have a strategy in place, it's time to start practicing questions using this method. With repetition, you'll feel more confident in navigating even the most challenging of questions under time pressures. So let's have a practice question. We will start off slow with this first question. So we'll just read the passage. A 62-year-old man presents to the emergency department with severe, crushing chest pain radiating to his left arm and jaw. He is diaphoretic and anxious. His medical history includes hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and smoking. An electrocardiogram shows ST segment elevation in leads 2, 3, and AVF. The patient is immediately treated with aspirin, oxygen, nitroglycerin, and a thrombolytic agent. 6 hours after the onset of symptoms, the patient suddenly develops hypotension, jugular vein distension, and clear lung auscultations. Despite resuscitation efforts, the patient dies. Autopsy reveals a ruptured free wall of the left ventricle. Which of the following is most likely responsible for the patient's death? Now that you've read the passage, take a moment to mentally rephrase the actual question that they're asking. Focus on the specific question posed in the last line and restate it clearly in your mind. The literal question that they asked in this vignette is on the last line. Which of the following is most likely responsible for the patient's death? But what are they actually asking you? So let's revisit the passage and highlight the pertinent information, right? So we have a 62-year-old man. He has crushing chest pain radiating to his left arm and jaw. There's ST segment elevation in leads 2, 3, and AVF. Autopsy reveals a ruptured free wall of the left ventricle and was the most likely responsible thing. A helpful exercise is to restate the question in your own words, making it as clear and straightforward as possible. This will help you focus on answering it concisely and accurately. We know that we have a 62-year-old man with crushing chest pain radiating to his left arm and jaw, ST segment elevations in multiple leads, and a free wall rupture to the left ventricle, who seemed to have died 6 hours later. With that information, the passage is asking, what caused all of this? You could simplify the question to a 62-year-old man, chest pain, and ST segment elevation in multiple leads. 6 hours later, he died. What was the cause? By breaking down all of that information, we've stripped away the fluff and condensed the passage into a clear and concise one-sentence summary. This sharp focus sets us up for success because we know exactly what we're looking for in the answer choices, making the process much easier and more efficient. In actuality, the question in the passage is asking, what caused the person to die 6 hours later after having a heart attack? Or essentially, what caused the heart attack symptoms? Now let's actually look at the answer choices. We have A, neutrophilic infiltration and enzymatic digestion of the myocardium. B, coagulative necrosis of the myocardial tissue. C, fibrinoid necrosis of small coronary vessels. D, chronic inflammation and fibrosis of the myocardial wall. And E, lipid-laden macrophages in atherosclerotic plaques. Go ahead and pick from one of the answers. How to review a question. Now that you've selected an answer, it's time to review it by looking at the correct option. Since we're just getting started, the focus isn't about getting the question right. Instead, the goal is to nail down the process. If you get the process right, the correct answer will always follow. But if you don't understand how you got to the right answer, you're leaving it up to the luck gods. And trust me, they're not usually in your corner, especially when the pressure is high in step 1. Relying on luck for 280 questions is like throwing up a prayer. And at some point, your luck's going to run out. So let's work on the technique. So the correct answer is A, neutrophilic infiltration and enzymatic digestion of the myocardium. It's often weakening the myocardial wall and leading to the risk of rupture. Now that we've chosen our answer, whether you knew it or not, here's what you need to understand. Signs of myocardial infarctions, or one of its causes, is neutrophilic infiltration and enzymatic digestion of the myocardium. All the other answer choices don't accurately describe what's happening during a heart attack. This is a prime example of what I've emphasized before. Often, the passage will describe something specific without explicitly naming it. The answer choices will throw in distractions, but there's always one answer that aligns with what the passage is truly saying. Your job is to match what the passage is suggesting with the answer choice that is correct. So essentially, both the passage and the right answer choice are saying the same thing in a different way. It's your task to recognize the connection. Think of it as A equals B equals C, where A is the passage's reference, B is the definition you're forming in your head, and C is the answer choice that is correct. You're simply matching those ideas together. That's it. That's step 1. Now that you have the correct answer, what's next? This is where you dive into the crucial part. Reviewing the question and creating your content review crib sheet. Typically, when you're using UWorld or Amboss or any other question bank, you'll be in tutor mode so that after you answer your question, you can immediately review it. This method works well because you don't want to answer 80 questions at once and then you have to go back and review them all at the end when everything is just a blur. Instead, taking your time with each question, getting the reps in, but making sure each rep is the best it can be. Once you answer a question, take time to review it. If you had no idea what the question was asking, this is when you dive into the explanations. The detailed breakdowns they provide is often exactly what you need to understand the concept of the question and how to answer it correctly. This process is more effective than just rote memorization or skimming through resources like First Aid or Pathoma, because you're applying what you're reading directly to the questions on hand. Nothing against the other things, but this isn't medical school. We just need to get through this exam. So trim the fat. Instead of wasting time on innocuous facts that don't have any immediate relevance to you, this approach allows you to focus on the most pertinent information and understand its application. You already know where to start, since you've seen the context of the questions and have a solid explanation to work from. Once you've read through the explanation and the educational objective, grab a piece of paper and start building out your crib sheets. The crib sheet should become your go-to for content review, but now it's targeted towards what's actually being asked on the exam rather than generic facts that you have to find a way to infer. You know exactly what you need to work on, and you have an opportunity to work on it directly from your own writing and your own words. How to create a content review crib sheet. So with your pen and paper in hand, your goal is now to write 1 to 2 lines answering this essential question. What information did I need to know to get the question right in under 90 seconds? The key is to keep it clear and concise. This isn't about rewriting the whole explanation or overloading yourself with extra details. It's about capturing the core insight that helped you solve the problem. What truly mattered for getting the question actually correct. Why are you writing this by hand rather than copying, pasting, or typing? It's all about kinesthetic learning. The physical act of writing helps you retain information more effectively. Plus, you're practicing how to break down complex information into simple, actionable steps that will actually be useful to you on the test. This process sharpens your second and third level reasoning, which is crucial for understanding not just the facts, but also why they matter and how to apply them. So, for this particular question, ask yourself, what was the passage really asking me? What was the key information or concept I needed to know? And how to eliminate wrong answer choices. By answering those questions in a few simple lines, you're solidifying that knowledge in a way that you'll remember, and you can use that again when similar questions come up. Now, for this question, we know that the question was asking what causes a patient to have heart attack symptoms and eventually die of free wall rupture. The answer is neutrophilic infiltration and enzymatic digestion of the myocardium. Therefore, I would write neutrophilic infiltration and enzymatic digestion of the myocardium leads to heart attack. Free wall rupture can lead to death after 6 hours. After going through all the information in the explanation, you realize that to get to the right answer, all you needed to know was the connection between ST elevation, symptoms of a heart attack, and the idea that free wall rupture causes death after 6 hours. From there, the only answer that makes sense is neutrophilic infiltration and enzymatic digestion of the myocardium, because that is a hallmark of a heart attack. The other answers simply just don't fit. Once you have this key insight, you jot it down on your crib sheet and you move on to the next question, applying the same approach and methodology. Typically, you do this for every question you get wrong so you can direct your content review effectively. This process is also helpful for jotting down tumor markers, mechanisms of actions of drugs, or other concepts that you're uncertain about. By building out your crib sheets, you're creating a personalized content review system that is directly relevant to your specific knowledge gaps. As you go through your questions, this is where you'll focus your study efforts. Each note you write down serves as a key to filling in those gaps and committing the information to memory. At the end of the day, you should have a strategic list of concepts to work on. And since you've done all the hard work of reading the explanations and educational objectives, this focus review will help you solidify that knowledge. The goal is to commit these concepts to memory so that when you are faced with a similar question, you'll never get it wrong again. So remember, UWorld, if we're using question banks as an example, specifically, gives you thousands of practice questions for a 280 question exam. So there's no need to go beyond that or risk burning yourself out. The goal is to pass the exam, not ace it. If you're consistently scoring at or above the passing mark around 62%, you're on the right track. Once you've hit that target, you can focus on moving forward to the next challenge in your medical education. How to write a clinical clue. Since step 1 is heavily focused on clinical presentations, it's important for you to train your brain to recognize patterns in clinical clues that will help you identify the correct answer. Many of the passages you'll encounter on step 1 are designed around clinical vignettes that give you a roadmap to a specific diagnosis or disease process. Instead of thinking about the questions in isolation, you can use a systematic approach where certain clues, A plus B plus C, will almost always point to a specific condition we'll use as D. But in some cases, the clues may change slightly, A plus E plus F, leading to a different outcome, Z. Since I'm an analytical person, I like to approach these questions as if they are additive. If you're given a specific component, symptom, a test result, a patient history, those will naturally lead to an answer. Step 1 doesn't try to trick you, but it can mislead you with unnecessary details. This is similar to how a lot of resources in medical education operate. They overload you with information that isn't always useful for answering questions. And that's just what it is. The key to success is learning how to navigate the clinical clues presented in the passage. Once you do that, you'll be able to sift through misleading information and focus on what matters to find the right answer. So, just like we practice restating the question and creating our 90-second crib sheet explanations, we can also add a section for clinical clues to the majority of our clinical vignettes. So what is a clinical clue? A clinical clue is a piece of information that leads you towards a particular diagnosis or answer. These clues are often based on specific patterns that are consistent across cases, such as a set of symptoms or a particular lab finding. By training yourself to recognize these, you'll be able to predict where the question is headed as you read through the passage. How to use clinical clues in practice. Start adding clinical clues to your crib sheets and eventually use them to create Anki cards. This will help you reinforce your understanding of how clinical vignettes point towards certain diseases. As you practice, you'll start recognizing these patterns more quickly and be able to draw connections between the clues and the passage and the answer choices. For example, if you see a vignette with symptoms like chest pain, radiating to the left arm, and ST segment elevation on ECGs, the clinical clue points towards a myocardial infarction. When you build this into your study routine, they will serve as mental shortcuts that make answering questions more efficient. Eventually, the clinical clues will become automatic, allowing you to navigate clinical presentations with ease and get to the correct answer faster. So think about it. If we're training for the exam, and the exam is centered around clinical vignettes, and all the clinical vignettes are going to give you clinical clues, then studying clinical clues every single day is preparing for the exam. You're training for the exam. Just like if you're running track, it's probably good to run every day. And more importantly, if you're a sprinter, it's probably good to do sprints. Same concept. So going back to our previous clinical vignette, a 62-year-old man presents to the emergency department with severe crusting chest pain radiating to his left arm and jaw. He is diaphoretic and anxious. His medical history includes hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and smoking. An electrocardiogram shows ST segment elevation and leads to 3 in AVF. The patient is immediately treated with aspirin, oxygen, nitroglycerin, and thrombolytic agents. 6 hours later, the patient suddenly develops hypotension, jugular venous dissension, and clear lungs on auscultation. Despite resuscitation efforts, the patient dies. Autopsy reveals a ruptured free wall of the left ventricle. Which of the following is most likely responsible for the patient's death? Our clinical clue would be 62-year-old male or an adult, crushing chest pain plus ST segment elevation equals myocardial infarction from neutrophilic infiltration and enzymatic digestion of the myocardium. Or 62-year-old male with the myocardial infarction, death after 6 hours, that equals free wall rupture of left ventricle. In this section, you'll notice that I've developed multiple clinical clues, as there are several key details in the passage that are important to recognize immediately. These clues serve as mental markers, helping me quickly identify certain conditions to diagnose as I read through the vignette. While they aren't full clinical vignettes themselves, these clues act as navigational tools, guiding me through the passage and allowing me to orient my thought process in a way that is helpful for efficiently tackling each of these questions and expand my knowledge base over time. Clinical clues are not full explanations or comprehensive diagnosis. Instead, they're quick references to help steer you in the right direction. For instance, if I come across a phrase like pleuritic chest pain and recent travel, I would immediately start thinking about pulmonary embolism. By focusing on the clinical clues as I read, I'm able to navigate the vignette more efficiently, identifying the most relevant information and ignoring the extraneous details. How to use clinical clues in a passage. As you encounter these clues while reading through the questions, they serve to narrow down your thought process to a few possible diagnoses or answers. Think of them as shortcuts for your brain, triggering associations with diseases and conditions you've previously studied. This not only speeds up your decision-making process, but also improves your accuracy by anchoring your thoughts in what is the most relevant to the question being asked. You're treating this like a funnel where you have all this information and certain clues will help you narrow down immediately. Building clinical clues for each vignette. When you see certain phrases or lab results in a passage, your mind should instantly go to a handful of possible conditions. For example, fever, night sweats, and weight loss. Think tuberculosis or lymphoma. ST segment elevation on ECG. Think myocardial infarction. Recent antibiotic use, followed by diarrhea. You're probably thinking C. diff. Over time, as you work through practice questions, you'll develop a catalog of these clinical clues, which will help you orient in a very structured way. This helps you build your knowledge base strategically, and eventually, you won't need to pause and think. You'll see the clues, recall the conditions, and match the answer choices. By practicing this approach regularly, you're preparing yourself to not only work through the vignettes quickly, but also to make confident, accurate decisions. You'll be training your brain to focus on the most relevant information as you build your diagnostic skills, ensuring you're ready for those challenging clinical vignettes on step 1. Now that you have a solid understanding, the goal is to apply the methodology we've discussed. Simplify the question. Read the last sentence first, break down the vignette to identify what's actually being asked, focus on the key components, and make the question clear, concise, and to the point in your mind. Answer the question. Choose your answer by matching the clues in the passage to the correct answer choice using your knowledge and process of elimination. Review your answer. After selecting your answer, review whether it was correct or incorrect. Regardless of the outcome, figure out what the specific information was necessary to get the question right in 90 seconds. And then create a crib sheet. Add any useful facts or concepts to your crib sheet, including the clinical clues that you can use to review later. This will consolidate the information and ensures that you'll have a quick reference to look back on when you encounter similar questions. Take your time with each question, but make sure you're honing in on the key points and focusing on the process. The aim here is to develop the habit of breaking down questions systematically. So by the time you reach your exam, this approach should become second nature. Now let's tackle some practice problems. So some content areas to focus on for Usmle Step 1. And these are the priorities that I personally did. I focused my studying on UWorld, but this progression can be applied to other question banks as well. So before I did anything, I did a first pass of mixed blocks of all the subjects, especially the general principles ones. And so I started off with biochemistry and general principles. Then I did my genetics, my microbiology, my pathology, my pharmacology. And then using all the subjects, having those selected, I chose all the biochem questions, which is about 156 questions. And I just focused on those. Then I moved down to all my genetics. So doing 106 of those. Then I moved down to my histology, which was a good 29. And then I did all the biostats questions. Then I did all the immunology questions. And then I did all the embryology questions, and then all the behavioral science questions and social science questions, and mainly just the communications ones, because I wanted to focus on communications in general. Then from there, I did all the behavioral psych questions, which is 179. Then from there, I did all the miscellaneous multi-systems, which is about 23. And then I did all the dermatology questions, because dermatology is a big one on STEP as well. And then I did mixed blocks of all the subjects for reproductive, which is the female reproductive and the breast, as well as the male reproductive. And I spent most of my time for the first week just cranking out all the questions I possibly could in the above sections that I mentioned. I wanted to get a good grasp of what was expected of me for the actual exam. The purpose of this was to get the exposure to the concepts in the context that would be tested, not to test whether I knew it or not, but whether I've seen any of it before. This isn't to test you, it is to train you for the test. So think of this as getting your reps in. So suggested blocks for doing questions. After I finished a first pass of all the questions I've mentioned, and also taking a practice exam to see where I actually am at, I proceeded to create blocks of questions based on the suggested content area distributions from the NBME and from my gaps. I spent most of the time in the high yield, low question count area first. And so, no, just like focus on question-based questions with specific intentions based on the official NBME breakdown, right? And so I mentioned never do 40 question mixed blocks because that does not help you, right? What you can do is between 10 and 20 questions for each block and the priorities. And so if we're using UWorld as an example, I would select for the subjects, I would select either all the subjects or just pathology, and I would do all the general principles and the multi-systems as one block. And I'm only doing 10 to 20 questions for that. Then for the second block, I'm doing the 4 Ps, so pathology, pathophysiology, physiology, and pharmacology. And I'm doing that for endocrine, reproductive, hematology, oncology, and neuro. Then for my third block, I'm doing the behavioral sciences subject, and I'm using psychiatric behavior and social sciences without communications. So you don't want to select communications in this block. And in the fourth block, I'm selecting all the subjects, and I'm doing biostats and communications only. So only communications and biostats. For my fifth block, I'm selecting biochemistry, immunology, histology, pathology, physiology, and pathophysiology as the subjects. And then I want to choose my systems being biochemistry, immunology, and cell biology. And that's block 5. Then block 6, we're going back to the 4 Ps. And I'm doing cardiology, renal, pulmonary, and GI. For block 7, I'm doing genetics, microbiology, embryology, and anatomy for my subjects. And I'm selecting all the systems. And that's going to be block 7. And finally, block 8, I'm selecting the subjects of biochemistry, pharmacology, physiology, and microbiology. And I'm selecting all the systems. And those are my first 8 blocks that I would do. And after a couple weeks of that, then I may switch it up. And so if we're talking about phase 2, where we've gone through phase 1, which is our first pass of stuff, then phase 2 would be those blocks that I suggested. Then we're moving into phase 3. And those suggested blocks are actually the blocks that I recommend doing after I took the exam the second time and passed it. And so if I were to refine my blocks, this is what I would do. And typically this is what I would do in phase 3, so weeks 5 and 6 of our study plan. And so block 1, I select all the subjects and I do general principles and multi-systems as well as the poisonings. Block 2, I'm doing the 4 Ps and I'm doing cardiology, renal, and pulmonary. Block 3, I'm doing 4 Ps as well. And I'm doing GI, endocrine, and reproductive, both male and female, as well as pregnancy. Block 4, I'm doing all the subjects and I'm selecting neuro, hematology, oncology, and rheumatology for the systems. Block 5, I'm only selecting the behavioral sciences subject, and I'm doing all the psychiatric and behavioral sciences, as well as social sciences without communication. Block 6, I'm selecting all the subjects, and I'm only doing the biostats and communications. Block 7, I'm selecting subjects microbiology and histology, and I'm doing all the systems. And in block 8, I'm selecting only biochemistry and immunology for the subjects, and I'm doing all the systems. So this is a more fine-tuned version of the blocks, and there are some overlap, but there's also some very specific focuses on the higher yield content areas based on the percentage breakdown for the MBMEs. And so the content areas that I would do maybe 2 to 3 times after taking my exam, if I were to do it again, would be all the general principles. So all the general principles questions, all the multi-systems questions, all the dermatology questions, all the social sciences, communications questions, all the reproductive, male, female, childbirth, pregnancy questions, and then doing all the biochem questions for all the systems, doing all the immunology questions for all the systems, doing all the genetics questions for all the systems, doing all the biostatistics questions for all the systems, and also doing all the histology questions for all the systems. If you just need to drill out some questions, I would focus on doing those 2 to 3 times before going into my exam if I were to do it again, because I felt those are the ones, particularly in UWorld, those are the ones that really showed up for me. And they're reflective of the actual content breakdown. And so if you know those like the back of your hand, you should be really good. How to use Anki. So Anki is an excellent tool for spaced repetition and rapid recall of high yield facts, but it can quickly become overwhelmingly ineffective if not used correctly. So here's how to get the most out of Anki. Focus on quick recognition and not long explanations. Anki is about rapid recall, not reasoning. So focus on being able to answer each card in 10 to 12 seconds. If you find yourself spending longer time on a card, the information is either too complex for Anki or the card is poorly designed. So it requires a little bit of reflection on your part. Stick to straightforward facts, such as drug mechanisms. What is the mechanism of drug X? Interleukins and clinical markers. What is IL-2 associated with? What does CD4 represent? And enzyme deficiencies. What deficiency causes disease X? The goal is to quickly recognize stuff under pressure, similar to what you'll need on the exam day anyway. So again, you're training for the exam. Prioritize high yield topics. Focus your Anki deck on high yield subjects that are frequently tested. Clinical presentations, such as matched diseases to the classic patient demographics and presentations, drug mechanisms and side effects. Anki is especially useful for just drilling pharmacology. Drugs, right? Histology and biochemistry. Quick visual recognition of key patterns. You see a slide, know what the heck that slide does. By focusing on high yield material, you won't waste time on obscure facts that are just unlikely to appear on step 1. Again, it's only 280 questions. Use spaced repetition to your advantage. Anki's strength is its spaced repetition algorithm. That's why everybody uses it. It mixes and spreads out the cards and organizes and all that stuff. It does it. That's what it's for, right? Make that work for you. Stick to your daily review routine and let Anki schedule your cards for you. The more consistently you use it, the more the algorithm will reinforce those concepts you're struggling with while reducing time spent on material that you've already mastered. This big one is make your own cards based off of what you need. One of the biggest advantages of Anki is the ability to create your own cards. While third-party decks can be useful, I found that making my own cards significantly improves my retention and understanding of the material. When you create your own cards, you are forced to reinforce what you already know, making the cards help you internalize the key concepts that are relevant to you personally. And then Focus on what you actually need to know. Instead of being overwhelmed by someone else's deck full of obscure or irrelevant facts to you, you can prioritize the material that is most important for your learning and exam strategy. I will say, put an asterisk there. There's certain things that you just need to know. And by virtue of this whole step 1000 thing, I actually made that stuff for you. So it's the stuff that I used, and it's really basic stuff of just like, what is this mechanism of action? If you don't know it, you better know it, right? And so instead of having to make that stuff, you could focus on the stuff that is more tailored to you, and you could just drill the stuff that I used. Using third-party decks can be helpful, but I often found that those decks just contain too many innocuous or overly detailed facts that weren't essential for exam preparation. So by creating my own cards, I made sure I was focusing on material that I needed to know to review in a way that was directly relevant to my performance. One of the big things is building over time, right? So limit the number of cards you do. Don't overload yourself with 2,000 new cards at once. Set a realistic goal of reviewing 500 to 1,000 cards a day, depending on how comfortable you are with the material. Any more than that can lead to burnout and reduce your retention rate. So just keep your daily card load manageable and avoid overwhelming yourself, but also try to be as consistent as possible. And then integrate Anki with your practice questions. Anki works best when you integrate it with your practice questions. After you complete a practice question block, add any facts you missed or struggle with to your Anki deck as clinical clues and crib sheets. This way, you can reinforce the key concepts that you want to take away from your practice questions with your daily review. And this is just going to be constantly reinforced with all the other things that you're doing, with your handwritten notes and everything else. Because the goal is to create as many opportunities for you to get a lot of repetitions in a variety of different ways. And then you just rinse and repeat. How to combine practice questions and Anki for maximum efficiency. So the goal of this resource is to help you use tools you already have in the most efficient way possible, so you don't get overwhelmed by the process of studying. This isn't just about saving time in the short term, but about optimizing your overall study efficiency. It's a workflow. If you can save even an hour a day by the end of the week, that adds up. Time you can dedicate to other important things like your hobbies or personal well-being. The key question is, how do you take your notes and convert them into effective tools for active recall? And how can you save time by staying productive? Through my experience, I found that using automated tools such as ChatGPT, along with built-in features in Anki for batch imports and content creation, makes the process smooth and significantly more efficient. It's all about working smarter, not harder. And this resource will guide you on how to actually do that. Converting your review notes to Anki cards. So referring back to the previous section where we worked through our practice questions, right? We developed a crib sheet, a 90-second information blurb, and a few clinical clues. Now, I'm going to walk you through how I batch create all of this information into Anki cards without having to manually create each one. Instead, I use an automated process built right into the Anki platform. This way, you can efficiently turn your notes into powerful active recall tools without spending hours making cards one by one. I'll show you how to streamline the process so that all the essential points, clinical clues, and quick review notes you've collected can be converted into Anki cards that reinforce your knowledge and save time. So we have our crib sheet, 90-second information. MSH2 is associated with mismatched gene repair. A mutation leads to Lynch syndrome. Our clinical clue, 45-year-old female plus family history of colon cancer plus multiple adenomatous polyps plus MSH2 gene mutation equals Lynch syndrome. Also, mismatched DNA gene mutation equals Lynch syndrome, MSH2, MLH1. First thing I'm going to do is to take all the clinical clues and crib sheets we've created and place them into a text document or a Word document. Once everything is compiled, the next is to reformat the crib sheets and clues so that they're ready for conversion into Anki cards. To do this, I make sure that the card formatting is consistent across each line or section I want as a card. This includes dividing the text into two sections, the question or prompt, what you'll be actually quizzed on, and the actual answer, the information that you need to recall. By structuring your document this way, it will be pretty easy to import everything in one go, which is pretty good. It saves time and allows you for batch creation of your Anki cards. So you can make 100 cards in a matter of seconds. Now let's go through the process of ensuring this format works seamlessly when you upload it into Anki for quick, efficient studying. An example would be, my crib sheet is MSH2 is associated with mismatched gene repair. A mutation leads to Lynch syndrome. So front of card 1 would be associated with mismatched gene repair. And the back of the card would be MSH2 gene for Lynch syndrome. The front of card 2 would be MSH2 mutation can cause, and the back of the card 2 would be Lynch syndrome. And so in the text document, I would have associated with mismatched gene repair, a semicolon, and then MSH2 gene Lynch syndrome. The second line would be MSH2 mutation can cause, I have a semicolon, and then Lynch syndrome. So in this example, you'll see how to create two different cards from a single text document. Each line in the text document corresponds to a different flashcard, with the front and the back separated by a colon. The information before the semicolon represents the front of the card, or the question or the prompt, while the information after the semicolon represents the back of the card, which is the answer or the explanation. When you format the text document like this, Anki recognizes each line as a separate card. The key is to make sure that each card has only one semicolon per line, ensuring the correct distinction between the front and the back of the card. For example, clinical clue, ST elevation and chest pain, semicolon, associated with myocardial infarction. And for a crib sheet, neutrophilic infiltration and myocardial enzymatic digestion, semicolon, hallmarks of myocardial infarction. These two lines create two separate Anki cards, each with a front and a back. The semicolon acts as a signal for Anki to split the information between the question and the answer. And an important note is that each line should only have one semicolon. If your original crib sheets or clinical clues use semicolons, replace them with any other character to avoid confusing the Anki import process. And then line separation matters. Each new card must start on a new line, so ensure you press enter after each card. Also, make sure that each card only has one line's worth of stuff. So if there is a separation or a paragraph in your card, you need to remove that. So let's try this with clinical clues that we've created earlier. Add them to the text document following this format, and once you're done, we're going to import the document into Anki to automatically generate our flashcards. This process will significantly streamline your study sessions by turning your notes into active recall tools with minimal effort. So after that, you want to save your document as a text document after reformatting all your clinical clues and cribs using the semicolon method. Doesn't really work with .docx or any of those. Just save it as a text document, nothing fancy. And then you're going to choose your deck or create a new specific one for these clinical clue cards that you're going to create in Anki. Batch creating Anki cards based on notes. Here's a brief walkthrough of how to actually batch create your Anki cards based on your notes, right? Once we have Anki open, we want to go to File and Import. This will open a file explorer where you can select the text file that you just created that you have already formatted. And then from there, on the next screen, we're going to make sure to set the field separator to semicolon. That way it recognizes the semicolons that we actually created. This ensures that everything before the semicolon will be mapped to the front of the card and everything after will be mapped to the back of the card. The table preview will show how each row is split into two columns, with each row representing a card. After that, you're going to go to the import options and you're going to choose note type as basic. Make sure to select the deck where the cards will actually go. And it's easier to create decks based on these themes such as pharmacology, clinical presentations, or topics that you struggled with in exams, or specific exams that you've taken, or block numbers that you've done. This way, your Anki decks can stay organized. In the field mapping section, you want to double check that column 1 is mapped to the front of the card and column 2 is mapped to the back of the card. And after ensuring everything is in place, click Import at the top right of the screen, and this will generate all your flashcards based on your formatted text, saving you significant amounts of time, and you can get right into your active recall now. And once everything is imported, you'll be ready to focus on practicing with these newly created cards. This method is definitely ideal for converting your clinical clues, your crib sheets, or detailed notes into efficient study tools with minimal effort whatsoever. In terms of Step 1000 resources that I provide to you guys, we have the clinical charts, which are high-yield charts that have multiple markers for clinical markers such as interleukins, histology associations, mechanisms of action, CD markers, all that. Those are your charts. Then you have your Anki 1000 Anki deck, which has all of your clinical charts and mechanisms that are must-know information. Anything you have in your charts is in the Anki deck. And this includes all the information in the charts for rapid fire form. And so think of the clinical charts and the Anki deck as two sides of the same coin. Then we have our crib sheets. Those are written notes based on your practice questions where you have information that you need to know to get the question right in 90 seconds. No more, no less. I provided examples of mine, so all the ones that I have, but I encourage you to create your own as well. And you definitely should, because you'll be doing practice questions a lot. And then you have your clinical clues, which are written notes based on the trends in clinical presentations that are must-know information. And typically that may coincide with your crib sheets as well. And so having both of those, you have a lot to work with. My suggestion is to get the most out of all the resources, use the following strategy. In the morning, start with 1 to 2 hours of reviewing your crib sheets from the previous day's questions, clinical clues, and step 1000 clinical charts. Be in a constant state of leisurely reading during this time because you want to manage your stress and also not stress yourself out, right? So if you get used to it, the more you get used to it, the more it becomes second nature. And so when you can see them on the exam, you know how to navigate it. It's not shocking. And then midday, complete 80 questions in whatever question bank that you choose, and definitely do it in tutor mode and adding new facts to your crib sheets and clinical clues as needed. This usually takes about 3 to 4 hours for me. And so use it sparingly, but don't do more than 4 hours of doing questions. It's not worth it because there's other stuff that you could do. In the afternoon, I would suggest spending 1 to 2 hours on your Anki 1000 day. So focusing on active recall from your crib sheets and your clinical charts and your clues, reviewing the stuff that you did in the morning and the night before, right? So this is a moment for you to just focus on building those recall muscles. And then in the evening, you want to review your crib sheets from that day for about 1 to 2 hours before wrapping up the day. It's pretty much the exact same information that you reviewed in this period will be the first stuff that you'll be reviewing first thing in the morning. But this stuff is also pertinent to the stuff that you actually saw in your questions as well. So you already saw in your questions, and then you're seeing it a couple hours later in your crib sheet review before you go to bed. And then you're going to see that same stuff the next morning, first thing in the morning. And so this approach allows you to blend fact recall with application practice, creating a balance of steady routine that reinforces both your knowledge and your test taking ability, right? And it's not fancy and it does get boring, but we want to pass this exam and we want to be very prepared. So have at it. And so now let's trim the fat. You don't have a lot of time to waste. So your practice exam questions, your question banks aren't just for reading, they're for playing the game. Don't treat them like it's a bedtime story. It's there to teach you how to answer the questions, not to make you a textbook scholar. Focus on learning how to read a question stem, spot the clues, and take it down like it owes you money. Anki equals flashcard boxing gym. This isn't a place for essays. It's for reps. Short, snappy cards. See the prompt, say the answer, move on, 10 seconds per card max. Stop babysitting the pre-made decks. Yeah, they're pretty, but guess what? 80% of that stuff is just fluff. It's not going to make you better. So make your own cards. You remember what you write because your brain does the heavy lifting when you make it. So make it work for you. Crib sheets are your golden goose. Write down only what you need to get a question right. No fluff, no dissertation, none of that stuff. You're here to remember how to win the fight, not to rehearse a history lesson. If you want to teach, pass your exam first. Questions build test-taking muscles, not the other way around. UWorld or any other question bank isn't your teacher, it's your sparring partner. The more rounds you go, the better you dodge, weave, and knock out wrong answers. So just take advantage of it. And also, avoid overloading your plate. Don't try to hit 2,000 cards a day. Don't try to do 160 practice questions a day. This ain't a sprint, it's a marathon. Stay consistent, don't burn out. If you burn out, you're not working towards training for an exam. You're just wandering aimlessly. We don't want that. In this next chapter, we'll tackle the art of practice exams, how to choose the right ones, what to watch out for, and how to interpret your scores without losing your mind in the process. So stay sharp. Bottom line, if question banks like UWorld are your coach, Anki's your gym, and crib sheets are your playbook, then you're stepping into that exam ready to dominate. So stick to the plan, don't overthink it, and remember, every day's a fight. So train smart, not just hard. Because when the lights turn on, we don't have time for you to be messing around. It's time to get after it. It's time to get that money. Thanks for checking this out. This is Usmle Step 1000, created by me, Stephen Christian, a space where you can turn your Step 1 prep into something smarter, sustainable, and stress-free. If you found this helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. You can follow us on Spotify for more study tips and more audio podcast stuff, Instagram at Usmle Step 1000, and you can like the Facebook page to stay connected. Don't forget to download all the resources, all the Anki decks, the clinical clues, everything from the PDFs and everything that you saw in the videos you can find at www.step1000.com. And follow the blog for more updates as well at www.usmle.step1000.com, your one-stop shop for everything Step 1000. And if you like what I'm doing here and you want to follow or at least support, you can check me out on social media at Stuck on an Island. Thanks again, and I look forward to sharing more stuff about Step 1 prep and how to overcome these mental hurdles so that you can have the best possible experience possible. So again, I'm not going to hold you any longer, but remember, let's keep pushing forward one step at a time to 1000.